I'm this year's president of the League of Women Voters of the San Juans. It's our 20th anniversary this year, and we're still celebrating, so thank you for wearing the sticker. Wear it all day, we're still celebrating. I'd like to welcome some special guests from the rest of the state today. Would they stand up? Linnea Hurst, Samantha Shepard, and Christy Campbell are visiting with us. Welcome. How many of you here today have not had a chance to become members? Claire has information for you, and it's at the back of the room. We'd love to have you enjoy our many activities. The League of Women Voters does not endorse candidates or political parties, but does encourage informed and active participation in government. We work to increase understanding of major public policy issues, influence public policy through education and advocacy, and do take stands on issues after studying consensus. I have a couple of announcements. In May, on May 11th, at the Grange, we will be having our annual meeting, and it's going to be a potluck lunch, no fee, where you bring a dish, your own plate, glass, and silverware, and a potluck dish, and the League will provide beverages. I would like to have a few silent auction items, so if any of you have something to offer up for silent auction, something kind of fun and different, so that people coming don't feel like it's like every other silent auction they've ever seen in their life, please call me. Now, Sarah Crosby will come up to introduce and conduct the program, but before she does, I'd like to say something about this extraordinary woman. She's been working steadfastly and creatively on programs for 5 years, and these programs are on key issues, which is one of our main League missions. She does this so well by researching and watching current events and current changes in attitudes, so I'd like to give her a special thanks right now for all she does. So, all yours.
I'm all blushing. Well, I'd like to extend a welcome to all of you as well, and thank you, Diane, for your kind remarks. I'm going to elaborate before we get started on a few of the program notes for the upcoming meetings. In April, our meeting will be devoted to DV-SAS, which is the Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Services of the San Juan Islands. The talk will be entitled The Darker Side of Paradise. We're going to have 3 speakers to talk about problems in the county from their perspectives. That meeting will be from noon to 2 here in the library conference room on Monday, April 13th. For anybody who has questions about the meeting and what will be contained in it, please contact Nisha Quast or myself until the end of this month. There will also be an announcement about this meeting in the next voter, which will come out just before the April meeting. Diane spoke to you about the May annual meeting, during which there will be the election of new officers and a board and the approval of a new budget, but we'll also have a speaker, Judy Chauvin, who some of you know. Her talk is entitled You All Come Back Now, and that's going to be about a recent visit that she made to Cuba. We think it will be really quite interesting. If you have questions about this program, please contact Claire Kelm. And in June, we're hoping to have an update from Representative Chris Litton on the current legislative session, particularly devoted to the McCleary decision and what happens concerning education in our state. But if Representative Litton is called into special session along with everyone else, we will show instead a film entitled One Woman, One Vote, which traces the fight for women's suffrage. Many of you have already seen the dramatization of the fight for suffrage, which is called Iron-Jawed Angels, and that is an excellent film as well. This film, however, has archival photos of the people who fought most loudly and most effectively for the right for women to vote, and we think it's a particularly good film. So if Representative Litton is not able to join us, we still think that you will find that meeting valuable. It will take place here at the San Juan Island Library Conference Room from noon to 2 on Monday, June 8th. If you have any questions about that program, please contact Ruth Fleming, who is part of the program committee. So for today's meeting, we're going to revisit some issues which our local league has devoted time to study and to follow. We feel that each of these issues, gun safety, campaign finance, redistricting, and the Washington Voting Rights Act, are critical to protecting our citizens and our democracy. League members are known in our communities as people who are interested in government and willing to take time to study issues and to take positions on them. We therefore become voices in our communities and in our social groups. For these reasons and more, it seems important to revisit topics we have devoted valuable time to study and to learn about, but which are not yet, if they can ever be, settled subjects. What has happened since we last talked about them? Today we will attempt to fill you in. Our speakers all have a particular interest in the issues they will be talking about, and I thought you might like to know why they have become involved in these particular issues. First, I-594 was passed in Washington in 2014. This measure requires universal background checks for the purchase of firearms in our state. What next? Speaking on this issue will be Margie Doyle, who is a resident of Orcas Island and a board member of our local league, as well as the editor of an online news site called Orcas Issues. Margie, in talking about this, says, "I am driven to gun safety activism by a sense of gratitude and responsibility that no one close to me has been harmed by gun violence, not in war, not at home, and not in the streets. Others haven't been so lucky, from the kids in the Columbine cafeteria, to the U.S. representative in a Phoenix parking lot, to the abused wife of a Tacoma police officer, and to the high school valedictorian, licensed to carry a gun, who was killed by her young son in a grocery store. And so I follow and participate, when possible, in the League of Women Voters' efforts to make gun safety a cultural priority, using laws to protect us and to defend our constitutionally guaranteed rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Second, in January of 2010, the Supreme Court of the United States struck down important campaign finance restrictions, allowing vast amounts of money to flow into our electoral process. Our speaker, Samantha Sheffer, who is a King County League member and member of the State League Citizens United Study Committee and longtime environmental activist, relates, "Since 1990, environmental education and protection was at the core of my career choices, whether working through the Seattle Audubon Society for rainforest conservation or converting corporate waste to recycling through Waste Management Northwest, or growing reuse and energy conservation in Washington through the Seattle Goodwill and partner organizations. Yet by the mid-2000s, with climate science being ignored, significant deregulation, and the EPA and other regulatory agencies under attack, colleagues and I felt that the need to address campaign finance reform was critical before even existing environmental policies could work. After the Citizens United ruling invalidated campaign finance regulation, it seemed pointless to work for any of my preferred causes until some core principles of the decision are reversed. Thirdly, in the years immediately following the 2010 census, states went through congressional redistricting process, which virtually ensured re-election for members of Congress of particular parties in large swaths of our country. Linnea Hurst, past president of the League of Women Voters of Washington, and current member of not only the State Redistricting Committee, but also the National Redistricting Task Force, relates her interest in this issue, saying, "I'm increasingly concerned about our democracy, about the decreasing ability of voters' voices to be heard, the increasing difficulty for people to be able to vote, and the seemingly increasing level of indifference of our voting age voters. Redistricting issues are part of the decreasing ability of voters' voices to be heard. And finally, despite a growing Hispanic population in Washington state, there are surprisingly few elected officials in the city, county, or state levels to represent the concerns of this growing constituency. How to remedy this? I will speak on this issue in place of Kathy Sakahara, who is a state board member and a league lobbyist on government issues and who could not be with us today. For me, the Voting Rights Act of Washington is a response to the growing populations of minorities in our state. We welcome them and their energies, but existing laws at the state and local levels make it difficult for these minority groups to participate in our democracy. I am with those who think that our diversity makes us stronger. I also feel that we all need to feel that our voices are heard. And the possibility of electing people who are of our communities seems a good way to make that happen. I want to personally thank our speakers who have traveled a fair distance and braved the whimsy of our ferries in order to update us on these important issues, and with luck incite you all to action. Talking to your neighbors, calling your representatives at the state and national levels to tell them that you want them to be vigilant on these issues and to support them. Today I will begin the talk, as I said, and Linnea will follow me, then Samantha and Marty. And lastly, before we begin, just a little bit more about Christy Campbell, who you met earlier. She traveled all the way from Texas, mostly to be with her friend Linnea. And now she comes to us to hear what we have to say and to know that we are all working on these important issues. Christy Campbell is a longtime League member who lives in Fort Worth, Texas. She and Linnea met in the 60s through the League of Women Voters. And Christy has been president of the Fort Worth League and is still at least somewhat active when her busy life permits. Thank you again, Christy, for joining us. And now to the Washington Voting Rights Act. This weekend, Saturday specifically, marked the 50th anniversary of the attempted march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. Known as Bloody Sunday because of the brutality with which the unarmed, peaceful marchers were met by law enforcement officials, this weekend, in '65, turned the tide in the fight for the Voting Rights Act, which was signed into law by President Johnson on August 6, 1965. The law is widely considered to be the most consequential piece of legislation of our time. It was written to end racial discrimination in voting. This law has been amended 5 times over the years to broaden and strengthen its protections, most recently in 2006. It complements the part of the 14th Amendment which provides for equal protection under the law, and the 15th Amendment which prohibits states and the federal government from denying citizens right to vote based on race or color, among other stipulations. A particular part of the Voting Rights Act, Section 5, involves pre-clearance by federal officials of any proposed changes in election laws in states or districts where a history of discriminatory voting practices can be shown. Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act spelled out the formula for ascertaining such discrimination. On June 2013, the Supreme Court of the United States, in Shelby v. Holder, struck down Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act, citing 40-year-old statistics which were being used to enforce the act. The majority decision said in part that the coverage formula conflicts with the constitutional principles of federalism and equal sovereignty of the states. By removing Section 4B, Section 5 was rendered unenforceable. In response to Shelby v. Holder, the Voting Rights Amendment Act of 2014 was introduced to Congress in January of that year. This act addresses districts with a current or recent history of voter discrimination and establishes a new formula with updated data for determining the need of pre-clearance of new election law in these districts. There are other new provisions which address other parts of the Voting Rights Act to strengthen it, such as requiring advance notice to the public before laws are enacted, and giving expanded authority for federal observer laws. It also makes clear the bar for a mandatory freeze on voting if practices are challenged in the courts. The bill, called the Voting Rights Amendment Act of 2015, is currently languishing in Congress, no surprise, stalled in the House Judiciary Committee. The bill had decreased bipartisan support when it was introduced this year, but nonetheless it was introduced. And to date, no Senate version has been put forth, though Senator Patrick Leahy is expected to do so shortly. Frustrated members of Congress wishing to reinstate these key elements of the Voting Rights Act are now talking about working towards a constitutional amendment as an alternative remedy. But this is a long, difficult process which would play out amidst a continual and determined erosion of voting rights by some states and districts. Those interested in weighing in on this issue should call our Senators Cantwell and Murray and ask them for their support when the bill is introduced in their chamber. And in the House, our Congressman Rick Larson is not listed as a co-sponsor of the bill, and those interested in this issue might want to call his office and ask that he sign on as a co-sponsor or at least support the legislation as it moves through the House. And now more specifically to our state, where the League is watching closely the progress of our own Washington Voting Rights Act, the principles of which are similar to those of the National Voting Rights Act, but which address the issue on a more local basis. The Washington Voter Rights Act was initially introduced in 2013, where it got little traction, if any, in the legislature. In 2014, it was reintroduced with bipartisan support. It was passed out of the House, but died in the Senate Rules Committee. It's now been reintroduced as of January 2015, and just passed out of the House last week, so it's now in the hands of the Senate Rules Committee, yet again. This legislation seeks to remedy a statewide lack of diversity in voter representation at the city, county, and legislative levels. Currently, a high percentage of elections in the state are at large. That figure is over 90%. The result of this practice is that large minority populations are underrepresented at all levels of government. Minority voices and concerns are not being heard. There are two important elements, among others, in the Washington Voter Rights Act. One which allows local governments to change from at-large to district elections with residency requirements, and the other allows jurisdictions to seek remedy in state courts when needed, rather than the long, arduous, and expensive federal court system used under the Federal Voting Rights Act. You may well be aware of the situation in Yakima, but in case you are not, the situation there illustrates powerfully the need for the Washington Voter Rights Act. The city has a 41% Hispanic population, but at least as of 2012 had never elected a Hispanic person to the city council. Though Hispanics had run for various offices in city government, they were never elected. In one instance, a declared candidate filed to run against an incumbent who had been appointed to a vacant seat on the school board and who is Hispanic. Shortly after filing, the candidate dropped out of the race, did not campaign, did not raise money, but won the election over the incumbent whose last name was Villanueva. If people with Hispanic last names are continually discouraged from running for office at the local level, if the hurdles are higher than fairness would dictate, then the political tradition of learning to be a candidate, of learning to legislate and to lead at the local level, using this as a jumping off point for higher elected office, will be lost to what is an increasingly large population of our state. In 2012, the ACLU filed suit against the city of Yakima in federal court under Section 2 of the Federal Voting Rights Act, which prohibits cities from using voting practices or procedures which result in a denial or abridgment of the right of any citizen of the United States to vote on account of race or color. The contention in the case, known as Montez versus the City of Yakima, was that the city's at-large voting system made it virtually impossible for Latinos to elect a representative of their choosing to the city council. Before going to trial in the case, the presiding federal judge issued a summary judgment in favor of the plaintiff, which basically means that the evidence was overwhelming and there was no need for a trial. In this case, the evidence that the odds against Hispanics being able to elect a Hispanic to the city council were overwhelming. As diversity in our state increases, these situations are likely to arise more frequently. Therefore, a strong Washington Voting Rights Act will be helpful in allowing jurisdictions to adapt to new population realities before the mighty hand of the Federal Voting Rights Act is used to do so. Tools in the 2015 Washington Voting Rights Act include a requirement that community members bring forward data and analysis to support their claims of flawed electoral systems. And there is also a delayed implementation schedule to allow local jurisdictions time to examine their systems and make new implementations. And there's also a 4-year safe harbor from lawsuits for these communities that do implement fixes to their electoral systems. The co-sponsors indicated that their bills are modeled on the California Voting Rights Act, which has been in place since 2001 and is widely viewed as having been highly successful. The League of Women Voters supports the Washington Voting Rights Act, based on our advocacy of fair election systems and accessibility. There is clearly still work to be done to get this passed. Among the 40th Legislative District delegation currently, Chris Litton is the only co-sponsor listed from our delegation for this bill. Representative Morris and Senator Ranker may well be supportive, and I suspect they are, but calling their offices and stating your support of this legislation might encourage them to both use their voices and their votes to help get this passed. Does anyone have any questions?
I have a question. I have a friend who lives in Yakima, and one of their frustrations is the fact that the Latinos will not register to vote. And so I don't know if was there any percentage of those 41% that are able to vote, and that's their frustration. They said they try to get people to vote and they won't.
I'm sure there are statistics on that, and of course it's always a question of which comes first.
Yeah.
And, you know, are they not voting because they don't feel that their vote is counted, or are they not voting for some other reasons?
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, Janet, I don't have a depth of knowledge about this that would, you know, give you any accurate.
He just feels that they don't see any reason to vote, and that's been his and because nobody's on there, right? But he said that's been the conversation that he's had, and trying to get them to register is it's not going to make any difference anyways. I'm not interested. But I don't know either if they're illegal.
Well, maybe this is grounds for a further update on this issue, and sometime in the future we'll try and track the progress.
It isn't just in Washington, it's in many of the southern states as well. I know Texas has that same problem.
Christy, does Texas have a Voting Rights Act that they're trying to put through the state?
I think probably not, because Texas was under the federal
Right.
and under the control until the recent decision, which then promoted a flurry of voter ID
Right.
statewide
Yeah,
regulations.
Texas is one of the states that's sort of cited as where
Yes.
so many of these problems are clearly defined. Tom?
There's a problem here in San Juan County. Every election, they have an Hispanic ballot with Spanish on it that people can get. And every time that Tim White has looked at this ballot, there's been significant errors, like candidates' names are not on there.
What?
Yes.
Wow. There are, as I know you know, certain regulations in place which tell the auditor's offices the extent to which they have to have a bilingual ballot. Certainly they are obligated to have candidates' names on there. I don't know what to tell you.
Well, I don't know either, except get on their asses in the next election and make sure that it's correct.
I think they're working on that at the state and the local level.
Well, we hear that all the time, don't we?
Well, but do we have any reason not to believe it?
Yeah?
Okay, well, we'll address that later. Any
All
more
right.
questions? All right. Now we will turn to Linnea, whose subject seems to dovetail nicely with the Washington Voting Rights Act. If you're concerned about a stalled partisan Congress, I urge you to listen about this most critical aspect of our electoral system. Linnea?
I'm going to turn sideways so that I can see the screen too. What does football have to do with redistricting? Well, I didn't think there was much, but there's a school district in an area of Baton Rouge that is arguing about where the lines go, and it has something to do with football. I didn't read any further than that. But I wanted you to know we're not just talking about Congress, although today I'm going to talk about Congress. All right, acknowledgements. Dr. Morrill, Benjamin Anderstone were the ones who drew the maps for me, and Julianne Kempf is the another member of the state redistricting committee who helped me with the PowerPoint. I'm assuming that you haven't spent a lot of time thinking about redistricting, and therefore I'm going to start with what is redistricting. Reapportionment is where it all starts. Populations move and change and grow, and at some point they're out of whack, and the lines are going to have to be drawn to get approximately equal number of people in the districts. I didn't know if I was going to have a laser. Is it lasering?
Not on one.
Okay, I'm glad I drew some arrows. It's the lower map that I think is most interesting, and that's the change that happened in the last 10 years based on the difference in population. It was Texas that grew the most, Florida next, and then some, including Washington. And the major decreases were New York and Ohio. The rest, the pale colors didn't change at all in their number of electorates. All right, redistricting then is drawing the lines differently. Now, even in the states that didn't have any change in overall population and therefore overall number of legislators, they still could have sufficient changes that they need to redistrict. And that's drawing the lines. All right, gerrymandering. How many of you have ever heard the term? That's what I thought. Well, that's generally considered drawing the lines, and whoever has the power draws the line in such a way that it benefits their political party. So, are any of these a good district?
Possible.
That's it, possibly. We don't know. You can't know if a district is good unless you know what it's trying to achieve. And I do have a handout which I'll have you get at the end of the meeting so that you're not sitting there looking at that one. Other information's coming. And this is what this is what the handout talks about, is which ones are good and which ones are bad. Okay. Now, there's arguments about how districting should be done so that it's not based on political things. And I'll show you a couple of hypotheticals. This is Washington, if it was done equal populations in compact districts. Well, the problem is I don't have it, somewhere, North Bend, part of North Bend is in with part of northern Spokane. Part of Tacoma is in with places like Goldendale. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And the next one was done for competitive districts, so that all districts, or nearly all districts, had real competition. Well, how would you like to be the legislator who had to know about Cincinnati all the way up to Youngstown, Ohio? There's real problems in figuring out how to do it so that it's good. Who draws the maps now? Well, this is part of a matrix that the National Task Force put together, and I thought you'd like to see what you don't have to look at. We're going to talk about who now draws the maps, and this is one of the maps that came from that matrix. Dick Morrill drew it for me. The legislature draws everything in pink, a commission draws everything in green, legislature plus somebody else gets involved in everything in the orange color. And Iowa has its own, it's a state agency that's nonpartisan, and it seems to work pretty well. So does anybody know which two states have independent commissions?
California's one of them.
California's one of them.
Minnesota?
Arizona.
Oh, really?
And that's, we're going to talk about Arizona in a few minutes. All right, but what I want you to look at is the yellow. It was the courts who were involved in redistricting in the last phase in redistricting. So they didn't do a good, the job was sufficiently bad that they got involved. All right, which states are still in the courts? Alabama was heard, it's called packing, where they put, for Alabama, that particular case, they put a lot of blacks in the same district so that they would have a representative, but so they couldn't have possible representatives in nearby areas. That was heard just before Thanksgiving. The decision should be out, I think, next week or sometime soon. Arizona was heard last Monday, and I'm going to talk about Arizona in a few minutes. North Carolina, the plaintiffs lost. It was another packing thing, and the League of Women Voters of North Carolina was one of the plaintiffs. And they're now headed, they're trying to get to the Supreme Court, if the Supreme Court accepts the case. Florida it's still in the courts. It's now in the Supreme Court of Florida, and the League of Women Voters of Florida is one of the plaintiffs. I'm not sure where Virginia is. I can't find anything, but that's been in the system. Okay, before I get any further, I want to spend a little time talking about Arizona. Oh, that's why I can't find this right here. What happened in Arizona is that they have an independent redistricting commission. It was by initiative, 2000, I think, is when it went in. In 2010, or 2011, with the new district lines being drawn, the Arizona legislature sued the independent commission, saying they did not have the authority to draw those lines. That was heard by the Supreme Court last week, and I want to read to you, you'll have to forgive me for reading, but this is what Professor Michael McDonald, who is one of the top experts in the field, had to say about this Supreme Court case. A ruling against the Arizona Commission would mean that every state except North Carolina, which has no governor veto, would be constitutionally suspect because the U.S. Constitution does not provide a role for a commission, or logically by extension, a governor in the redistricting process. Furthermore, with regards to the time, place, and manner of conducting elections, every election law ever passed by a state government through the legislative process, where the governor has a role or by ballot initiative, would be suspect. every state constitution that say sets voting eligibility requirements would be suspect, because the legislature did not have a role. The litigation and chaos that would ensue should make the Supreme Court blush at the least. And the Brennan Center for Justice estimates that perhaps 500 state laws would be affected if the Supreme Court agrees with the Arizona legislature. And by the way, the League of Women Voters of Arizona and the League of Women Voters of the United States are both defendants. And amicus briefs, I want to tell you, for the appellant, in other words, the legislature, there's two. For the appealers, what do we call it? 25 organizations, including the U.S. League and the Arizona League, plus 10 named individuals, plus, and it didn't say how many of these, plus members of Congress, state and local elected officials, scholars and historians of various redistricting, and one of the states that is an appealee is the state of Washington. There were, I don't know how many of them. I thought that was interesting. So that is a very important case, and until it's decided, and I probably will hear about it in June, until that's decided, we don't know what's going to be happening with redistricting. So let me go on. I'm going to ignore league positions. This, one of the tasks that the task force was required to do was gather all the information from all the states on what the positions are. I have them if anybody wants to know afterwards what they are. Then. So let's talk about league action. Before 2011, this is something the National Task Force came up with. Before 2011, there were only the ones in white were not at all involved. During 2011, which is during redistricting, there were a few states that were involved. And since then, there's been some activity. Obviously, the yellow and orange could easily have been involved well ahead of then. It's just that we tried to figure out who's now involved so that other leagues can help out with that. And the actions, well, early actions included initiatives, amicus briefs, lobbying, voter education, becoming legislators. As you probably, well, you possibly have heard, we have various league members who are now legislators. We've had various league members in the past. In fact, the redistricting for Washington State is because of a Seattle League member from the I think she started in the late 50s to try to get Washington to be redistricted. Even though the Washington Constitution had required it, it had never been done. Which is why the western side of the state was getting no money, the eastern side of the state was getting it all, because that's where the power lay. Okay, in preparation for the most redistricting, it's same kinds of things, plus joining and forming coalitions, setting up mapping and other contests and activities. And since then, it's the same kinds of activities are happening. So if you want to know what's happening in the league world, all these kinds of things throughout the United States, there's activities on that. One activity I thought was particularly interesting, League of Women Voters of Maryland. This is considered to be the most gerrymandered district in the whole United States. It's the green one. Well, the Maryland League, along with some coalition partners, conducted a walk, bike, boat tour of the district. Got a lot of good publicity and finally people noticed. By the way, I keep hearing that it's the Republicans who are doing the gerrymandering. Well, this is a Democratic state. So it's whoever has the power, folks. This is not a This is not a, what am I going to say, a one-sided kind of thing. And looking forward, these are the states that allow initiatives and referendums. Now, there's referendum and initiative, referendum and indirect initiative is the purple ones. Referendum plus direct initiative are the green ones. Referendum and direct and indirect, and Washington's one of the several that allows all those kinds of things. Referendum only, just New Mexico and Maryland, I think. Constitutional initiative only, Florida and Chicago, Illinois. By the way, this showed that New York is one of the ones that don't allow referendum initiative, and that's incorrect because New York just passed an initiative that now allows, is going to have a commission to do it. This is an important relationship. That's who redistricts, you saw that map earlier. This is which states allow initiatives and referendums. And if you look at the pink, that's the legislature is doing it. If you look at the yellow, if we want to fight to get independent commissions, we have to fight those who have the power to do it themselves. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Some of us have a much easier job than others. All right.
Good job.
Do you have some questions? Yes.
Does the mandate for redistricting vary state by state?
Yeah.
Are there any states that don't have any redistricting?
Yes. You're talking about leagues.
No,
No.
I'm talking about state government requiring redistricting happen at a regular time.
The U.S. Constitution requires something about redistricting. There are 2 states, I think. Texas was big in the news a few years ago because after a change of power, instead of waiting to redistrict until the next census, they redistricted. And I don't know if you remember, but it was the Republicans who got the power and the Democrats who left the state, the legislators who left the state in order there not to be a quorum. Well, that was because of redistricting. And I think Georgia is, I didn't realize it, but in reading about it, I think Georgia is the other one who didn't wait until the next census. But they are required to redistrict after the census. One of the interesting things about the league positions is there are not very many, let me see if I can find that here. Sorry, oh, not transparency, timeliness is the one. And the states in green are the ones, the leagues have a position of some sort on timeliness. Most of them just say vaguely it should be done or something, we just pulled it all into one. We actually have all the details. But all those states in white, the leagues do not have any position at all about timeliness. And after the situation in Texas and in Georgia, I think we need something on timeliness too. Otherwise, whenever there's a change in power, there's going to be redistricting. Yes?
So the timeliness would pertain to doing it in relation to the census? Or
Well,
set some sort of criteria?
Yeah, I think because until 2000 and, Christie, was it about 2005 when the Democrats had to leave the state in order in Texas,
It may have been earlier than that, I can't put a date.
2003 or 4. It was the next election after the redistricting had been done and the change in power. Until then, I think nobody even thought about considering doing it, considering it, and that's why I think no state leagues have the position, so.
Well, even before, way back when I lived in Texas, a significant group of the legislature decamped to Oklahoma someplace and stayed there. Nobody knew exactly where, but it wasn't even for redistricting. I think they just like to go to Oklahoma.
Well, in this case, it was because of the redistricting. Oh, that's interesting.
But the subsequent, you realize that when the governor called a special session on redistricting, and it was passed in the special session, so,
Yeah.
although it delayed it somewhat.
It didn't, it didn't stop it.
But then it ended up in the courts, and it was a long time before more settled redistricting
Yeah,
lines.
it's not really settled yet. The Texas, I'm not sure where it is in the courts, I can't visualize my piece of paper that said, but they allowed it to stay, the districts, the lines to stay where they were, even though they didn't think they were good ones for the 2014 election. But that doesn't mean they're allowing them, the courts are allowing them to stay. It's just it's in the process.
Would you just describe what the Washington State Redistricting Commission is? I mean, sorry. Don't we have supposedly a nonpartisan one?
It's a bipartisan.
Bipartisan.
Most of them are bipartisan. And in Washington State, the Democrats appoint 2, and they can't be current legislators, they can't be they can't be officers of the party or officials of the party. I'm not sure what the other things are. Those are the main things, and the Republicans appoint 2. It's the legislators that do that. And then they appoint a non-voting 5th person who's in charge. And they have to have 3 votes out of 4 in order for them to agree on, so it becomes bipartisan. But there's a lot of trade-offs that go on. Well, if you'll do this, we'll do that. So it's not as independent. So, yes.
I don't know if this is fair to ask, but because you work on this issue, do you have an opinion about what the ideal redistricting commission would be?
No, that's why I put those 2 slides in, one that, aimed for equal populations and compactness, and the other one that aimed for competitiveness. Because those are the arguments that go on now that we have such computerized ways of doing things. But how are you going to do it so that it makes sense? It's a difficult thing. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.
And now Samantha will talk to you about the campaign finance issue.
I can't. He said it would go away.
He lied.
Oh, my gosh.
We do that a lot up here.
Eventually it'll go away.
I'm sorry. Okay. When he did it, it went away.
Well, maybe we'll cut
Magic
itself
fingers.
off. I won't try and hit any buttons.
Oh, it's a head.
I'm sure that, given this audience, you all know some things about Citizens United and the decision of Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. It is a topic that among many of my friends in Seattle just makes them go, no, 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 no. I don't want to know, I don't want to care, it's way too big for me. I want to focus on my children's education and the issues around that, whatever. And I completely understand, as Sarah told you, this wasn't my kind of an issue. I didn't want to get into governmental politics and constitutional amendment stuff. I wanted to work on environmental legislation and environmental protections, and yet we started to realize well over a decade ago that whatever we accomplished or were able to hold on to was only temporary. And even if we got new laws passed or new protections in place, they could be defunded, they could be unenforced. There were all kinds of ways that our work was being nullified. So we moved to addressing campaign finance reform so that then we could go back to what we really wanted to do. And then along comes Citizens United and nullifies campaign finance reform, so we all kept moving up the ladder. And so this is an overview of some of the issues, and particularly what is good about Washington State. And of course, we encourage you to get involved on some level. And part of my job today is to give you a sense of why you want to get involved. But also there's something quite simple and direct that we can do, each of us as Washington citizens. So even if you only wanted to get involved a little bit, there's something very, very useful you can do. So to start with, some of you may know that in its original form, the court case, Citizens United versus the FEC, was actually meant to address a rather narrow technical definition of the campaign finance laws prohibiting TV attack ads prior to an election. What ended up happening, though, is that the Supreme Court itself decided to expand that case hugely to consider whether campaign finance laws violated the First Amendment. So it started out, with like this kind of an issue, and it became this kind of an issue. And as we all know, a lot of it came down to a reinterpretation of the First Amendment, the freedom of speech issue. So originally, the laws defined speech in different categories and qualities. So political speech was considered a very high value speech. In other words, you can't have an effective democracy if people aren't allowed to debate these issues freely and openly. Again, this was applying originally just to citizens. And then advertising or commercial speech was considered very low value. What has happened over recent years, and also within the Citizens United case, is that corporations have successfully argued, and the Supreme Court has supported the idea that much of what used to be considered commercial speech is now being considered political speech, and therefore cannot be prohibited, cannot be confined the way it used to be. So key elements of Citizens United. First, it pronounced officially that money does not lead to corruption. There's no evidence to say that money has any impact on corruption, nor does it have any ability to cause undue influence. So that concept right then and there, these all build on each other to justify these changes being made. With that concept in place, and with the change of commercial speech and political speech, it overturned decades of campaign finance regulation by calling it unconstitutional. It was no longer constitutional to interfere with this type of speech because it could not, or did not, or there was no sufficient evidence to say that it caused undue influence or could corrupt. So also with that, it expanded the rights of artificial entities. I'm using that term so that we don't just pick on corporations because it applied to unions and other things. That it applied to gatherings of individuals like corporations and unions and so forth, as opposed to those of us sitting in the room who vote as individuals. It expanded the rights of artificial entities beyond those of individual citizens. It therefore undermines the concept of one person, one vote, which is fundamental to democracy, and partly because
Sorry.
that's all right. Even if we ignore the whole issue of artificial entities, corporations, unions, et cetera, right now, because of the changes in, or the gutting of campaign finance regulation, if I happen to be a billionaire, I'm an individual just like Sarah, but suddenly, if my money equals speech, I have a much, much, much louder voice than Sarah, even as an individual citizen. One of the things that does is I, with a lot of money, or the corporation I belong to with a lot of money, can outshout citizens on getting candidates to run, getting candidates elected, and then getting candidates to listen to me once they have become elected. Not that our politicians and our elected officials necessarily like this game, but in order to compete, they have to play on the same playing field as everybody else. And so if Sarah's running and I'm running, she's got $1 bazillion, I need $1 bazillion to compete. And if I need to have $1 bazillion to stay in office, I'm going to listen to the people who can give me that money over Linnea, who has been a longtime constituent of mine.
But only
But
has
she-
$5.
Right. So, she can't keep me in office. And I may not like any of this, my heart may be in the right place, but I need to spend a huge portion of my time in office fundraising rather than doing the work of an elected official or listening to the people that used to be my true constituents and legitimately still are. The other piece of this, which can get confusing, so I won't get into a lot of it, but it is very critical, is that it led to the creation of the term we call dark money. There used to be hard money and soft money, and now there's hard money, soft money, and dark money, which basically is the super PAC money. Again, I can explain some of these terms later if you're more interested. But with that dark money, super PAC concept, it all comes down to being able to hide who has provided the funds. So suddenly, if you are not going to be found out, again, I'm a billionaire here now, well, Linnea and Sarah are running against each other, I can fund them both. Neither one of them will know that I funded the other one. And I can also be a foreigner, and I can fund them both. I don't have to be in the state, I don't even have to be in this country, because no one can track where my money came from. So it's very much affected not only the volume of money that plays out in our local, state, national elections, but also the sources of money beyond even American citizens. So now we want to, I'm going to back up and talk a little bit about corporations. Now the League is a corporation, of course, and there's been a lot of tension at times about, we don't want to bash corporations, and we don't, but it's the same thing, somewhat like the good politician who has to play the dirty game because that's what everybody else is doing, and that's where how the game is played now. The other trick for corporations is that whereas they used to be chartered to produce a certain product, to build a railroad, build a school, build a hospital, and then they were, their charter was revoked or nullified if their purpose had been served. That was the way corporations existed before. At the grace and the invitation of the states, now they are expected to go on for perpetuity, and their sole purpose has become keeping themselves alive and making an awful lot of money to satisfy their shareholders. So if suddenly your purpose is or your, certainly your highest purpose is solely financial, is solely profit-based, then you can't care about things that a good citizen would care about or make the world a healthier place to be. You can't care about clean air. You can't care about better benefits for your employees because that doesn't help raise your profits. So they have, and again, they've gotten themselves into a bind, those whose hearts are in the right place, care about these things, want to live in an unpolluted world, because their mission is dollars. And that interferes with all of the other things that we as a citizen can care about. We can care about a variety of things and vote for a variety of things, whereas corporations are unable to do that. So a couple of interesting figures, I won't throw a lot at you, but there are tons out there. As of 2011, which is now 4 years ago, 53 of the 100 biggest economies on earth were corporations. And that's, as I say, that's 4 years ago. Also, as of 2011, if the top 100 corporations spent just 1% of their declared profits, not their, other bigger piles, but their declared profits, they could outspend every candidate for president, for House, and for Senate combined. And again, these were their profits from 2011. So there's an enormous amount of money out there which has, because of Citizens United and these reinterpretations of speech, of the value of speech, of political speech versus commercial speech, and the gutting of campaign finance laws, which has allowed these floodgates to open, and this huge amounts of money coming from either individual sources who are extremely wealthy or collections of individual sources who are extremely wealthy to spend into the political system. So how has Citizens United already affected the average citizen? Some of this will be a bit repetitive, but the rights and protections that the average citizens have voted for repeatedly are either under attack or have been repealed already. Limits on campaign spending, transparency and disclosure in campaign spending, all of that has been fairly well nullified. The idea of one person, one vote, fairly well nullified. The Clean Air Act, the EPA, all of this is seriously under attack. In Washington State, we've seen some very definitive action on the initiative level with the charter school issues. Charter schools have come up for a vote 4 times in the past 10 years or so, and the public has consistently voted them down. And yet, this past time, the who's who of the funding for the charter school issue, it was like the list of the billionaires in the western Washington, the western region, not even just Washingtonians. And you and I and all of other league members put together, we can't outshout all the billionaires in Washington. So far we've succeeded. Liquor privatization was another issue. The gun safety issue, the NRA in 2013 funded 46 Washington candidates. And that was a tiny part of their spending in that particular election, but because of the initiatives, they gave money to 46 of our candidates. The GMO labeling issue, again, I think the final number became something like $46 million spent to affect that just in Washington State. And that money was coming, there were only 10 donors within the state, I think, and all the other people who were funding to disallow labeling of GMOs in Washington State were coming from out of state and were producing, to the tens of millions of dollars to shut that issue down just here in the state. Wealthy individuals and corporations are spending enormous amounts of money on political speech and were they not spending those $46 billion or whatever, that money could have gone, had they wanted it to raising wages, improving benefits, et cetera, keeping people employed, not going overseas, you know, I mean, that's an awful lot of money that could be doing good. Another issue with that is if you are now having huge amounts of money, you're able to spend huge amounts of money, you can pay signature gatherers. It hasn't been something I've been able to verify, but one paid signature gatherer said something about being paid $4 a signature. And if you think about that, you know, that very much changes what gets on the ballot in the first place or what doesn't. So people with money, individuals with money, corporations with money, money is deciding who we get to vote for and what we get to vote on. It also is, it's limiting citizens' choice of candidates to those who can afford to run and those who are capable and willing to spend much of their time in office fundraising. So if you have a personality that just isn't that keen on spending their life asking for donations, they're not going to be a politician anymore. They can't get there. And I would argue that many of them would make very good politicians. And then some of you may have come across the Credo study. They did, it's a fascinating study, and it was apparently so well done that no one has tried to duplicate it because it was so decisive. They had approached a bunch of elected officials and were going to bring them a bunch of constituents to speak with them, and they didn't really have time for that. So then they approached them again and said, we're going to bring you a bunch of donors, and suddenly they had time. And, you know, it's sad, but it's true. The other part of this, which people don't think about, don't talk about as much, is state courts beyond the federal court, but the state courts are now having to face lawsuits of existing laws defending either campaign finance laws within their own regions or public disclosure laws. After the GMO labeling initiative failed in Washington State, a Chicago law firm, huge Chicago law firm, hired by the Grocery Manufacturers Association, sued the Washington courts to have our public disclosure laws deemed unconstitutional. You know, our courts could be doing something better with their time and their money. How has Citizens United already impacted the League? Well, of course, these targeted influxes of money are all for very special interests, and so they aren't able to balance issues that are to the benefit of the average citizen. Most of the issues that the League cares about, and most of the issues I cared about before still care about, none of them, just like all of my environmental policies, none of them can either stick or stay or be enforced with this kind of money going around. The influence has changed, the game has changed, and good works, healthy policies are going to be under attack as long as somebody else can make money by making them go away. Also, the League, you know, is never going to be as wealthy as a Bill Gates or an Exxon. So right then and there, the playing field is uneven. There are also all these 501c4 organizations now that are truly just, you know, corporate mouthpieces for funneling money that cannot be tracked. And, you know, the League has been a very responsible 501c4. So, again, undoing the levelness of the playing field. And another piece that I've been considering just recently is the League used to have a lot of credibility. I'm not saying it doesn't have credibility anymore, but it used to have a lot of credibility among citizens, and therefore a lot of value to politicians and candidates as a leader of voter education. Now that politicians and elected officials are no longer as concerned about their constituents and the desires of their constituents, it takes some of the power of the league's ability to educate a group of citizens that have, therefore, an impact away. So, if they're focusing on donors rather than informed and involved constituents, the league has lost some of its edge. Now, wrapping up, the great news about Washington State is that currently we have maybe the single best public disclosure laws in the nation. And that is truly saying something. A lot of states have rather poor public disclosure laws. Ours is quite good, quite strong. It is being attacked, but it is quite effective for our purposes at this point. It could be strengthened, but it's as strong as any of them out there right now. And so, if you, after this conversation, feel like it's worth your time to get involved to protect all the other things you care about, the one thing that I urge you all to do is to use your voice, use your phone call, use your email, to let anyone you can know that you want to protect and or strengthen what we already have, because it is in jeopardy. It can be deemed unconstitutional. And we not only want, some of these things that Citizens United has undone to be reinstated, but in the meantime, we really want to hold on to our public disclosure laws. They can't tell us everything about where the money's coming from, but they can tell us quite a lot. And that is why the Grocery Manufacturers Association has hired a hotshot law firm in Chicago to try and take us down. One thing I didn't mention, and I'll just mention real quickly, one of the questions that could be obvious if I hadn't taken you into all these other details is, what are the ways to address Citizens United to make it, if we wanted to make it go away, what are the options? And there are really three approaches, one of them being a constitutional amendment, one of them being a Supreme Court decision reversing itself, and one of them being a legislative approach. Those of us who have studied the issue are not really in support of the legislative approaches just because they can be undone as long as Citizens United is standing. So I know that the sense of amending the Constitution can feel very weighty and overwhelming and inefficient, but that is what many organizations like WAMEND and so forth are fighting for. And then there are also off-the-cuff statements or not so off-the-cuff statements from Ruth Bader Ginsburg and so forth saying, at some point in time, we don't know how long, they do expect that Citizens United will be reversed. But until then, we need to protect ourselves. Yes, Sarah?
What would be the process of reversing Citizens United? Would there have to be some other case
Yes.
found and
Yes.
work its way through the court?
Yes.
So that's a fairly long process too.
Potentially, I am not an expert on Supreme Court process, but there are times when, a case will pretty quickly make it up the ladder and they are interested in taking it on. So they do, I didn't know this until I started being part of this research, but the Supreme Court can pick and choose what it wants to hear.
So it could get the word out that they're looking for a case.
Yes.
Which is what they
Yes.
do. And there is ever just that they might be doing that? I don't know.
I can't say if there's a case working its way up right now, but as I say, it was, again, I'm making an assumption here, let me clarify that it was a 4 versus 5 decision, a 5 versus 4 decision, as many of the recent, corporate supported cases have been. Lewis Powell, before he was appointed to the court by Nixon, he was a corporate lawyer who was, who had set out a plan for how to alter laws to give corporations more powers. And so he has been in that mindset prior to ever getting on the court. There were, 4 justices who did not agree with this decision, and there were 5 who did. So all of these decisions have been nearly split down the middle. It only takes one shift. And does that answer somebody's question effectively? Okay. And Steve, you had a question.
The grocery manufacturers, who are they suing? Are they suing the state of Washington?
They're suing the state of Washington, yes.
So our Attorney General is defending us against them, our Supreme Court, state Supreme Court.
And I don't know the latest on that, because that hasn't been my segment of research, but, and they, they won't be the only ones if things continue. The NRA didn't sue us, but it was because they didn't, the disclosure of their funding in Washington State didn't make a big difference to them, and they're fighting, as my research has indicated, and some of you on the gun safety might know this too, they're targeting their money very strategically and on a much more national level. They just want to get Congress to agree with them. So what happened in Washington didn't burn the boots, but the GMA expected with its funding that it was going to, the GMO issue, they expected they would win because they threw so much money in this direction and they didn't want to start a precedent. Yes?
How do anonymous donations or contributions work in the scheme of things where, a donation is made to support something, but there's no knowledge of anybody on either end of who made the donation, as opposed to, full disclosure or people like to make donations, say, for a charitable organization.
Yes.
Okay? But they don't want their name particularly attached either to the public or to the institution.
Right.
It's just totally anonymous. Is that what we're talking about, or is that a separate category?
Well, in this case, it is, I'm talking about something more specific because it is the political speech, it's the
Okay.
political funding.
Okay.
So it is, one case that I was just documenting is with the mayor's campaign in Seattle. The mayor's
Yes.
race was contentious,
Yes,
and,
yes.
the Seattle has its own campaign finance limitations.
Okay.
But they only are able to limit individual donations. So my check, your check, et cetera. But group donations, PAC donations,
I
the
see.
people for Ed Murray,
Mhm.
there's no ability to limit that. And so there was
So-
actually
yeah.
the McGinn group filed,
So even if
filed
it's
a
anonymous,
complaint.
somebody gets more than somebody else, and that would be the problem.
Right, and so the McGinn group filed a complaint with the Seattle Ethics Commission that the Murray PACs, they weren't blaming Murray himself, just the Murray
Yeah.
PACs had misrepresented
Uh-huh.
and misdisclosed money, and the Murray PAC got fined because it came out that there was this $12 million donation from Vulcan that they had tried to hide. Again, maybe because Vulcan wanted them to, but,
So the only way to really get around that, if, say, you were a very wealthy entity, either an individual or a corporation, say Bill Gates
Yep.
Foundation, which is a charitable thing, you wanted to assist in the political process by funding politicians, so you'd have to fund everybody equally.
not necessarily. You can do
But
whatever you
would-
want.
But you would, in order to make it a level playing field.
Right, if you wanted to make it a level playing field.
Because that would, say, if you want to support the political process in a fair way, you would have to fund everybody that's, qualified to be running on a particular election.
Yes, and if you were, we'll use Bill Gates, not to bash him, but just as a name, everybody knows there's
Okay.
plenty of personal money there.
Okay.
If you really wanted Sarah to win, and you didn't want Linnea to win,
Well, that would be corrupt.
no. If I as a person, if Bill Gates as a person, as a billionaire, has chosen Sarah as his preferred representative, and I don't want you to know that I am going to give her $40 billion, then Sarah has a super PAC, not a PAC, because you have to disclose.
Yeah.
She has a super PAC, which is
Yeah.
a 501c4 organization, and so they don't have to disclose where my money came from, where their money came from. We all get lumped together and hidden in the dark
No, I'm
money
in total
category.
agreement with you, I'm in total agreement, but I'm.
Does that answer your question though, of how
Yes.
it gets
Yeah.
hidden?
Here's another part.
Okay.
Do not confuse foundations with charitable goals and 501c3 charities with what she's talking about. Foundations that are founded for charitable purposes have rules and regulations, and they cannot
Yes.
donate to candidates, etc. So do not confuse genuine charitable destinations like the Red Cross
Yes.
or whatever, and a Bill Gates Foundation that is a charitable foundation. He may have another foundation
Right,
or a
exactly.
PAC or whatever, but that's not what she's talking about.
Yeah, so the Bill Gates Foundation would not get into political spending in an unethical way because of their
Just say
limitations,
you're,
right?
you're a student of government and you look at democracy as a charitable institution on the planet that gives people a chance to participate in the rules of how we live together as human beings. In that sense, the government should be a charitable institution, right? So supposing, you happen to be well-funded and across the board, you want to provide funding for the political process. I guess that's kind of what I was.
So that, I think that might speak similarly into the issue of the publicly funded election,
Mhm.
which, again, many of us would have been in favor of, but unless you can force everybody to just play with that pot of money, it won't fly.
Well, I think that's the correct thing to do personally. but-
It would be great, yeah.
You wouldn't be alone.
Yeah. Are there any other questions with you? Yes.
Would you comment on the move to amend group that's pushing for rolling back
Sure.
Citizens United?
Sure. Move to amend is, and there's move to amend and then there's WAMEND. WAMEND is the Washington State branch of move to amend. And they are probably the largest and best organized group and most educated group on the issues of what it requires to amend the Constitution and potential wordings of amendments. So their website is a very good resource. I found them to be really, really knowledgeable, not just, angry and active, but really knowledgeable. And so if you're interested, they are one of the many good resources, but one of the best in Washington State. Yes, yes.
Is there anyone who is tracking, I guess, sort of the indirect effects of decisions like Citizens United? One of your sort of subtexts is this will lead to undermining regulatory compliance because somebody could have undue influence and just change the law, right? Is somebody tracking changes to the Clean Water Act, changes to the Clean Air Act as a result of super PACs?
I don't know if they would say directly as a result of super PACs, but there are tracking. It's, again, in many places it's very hard to track. In Washington, we have the benefit of the good disclosure law, so we can track some of these things. But if there are no disclosure laws in place, then it's very hard to follow the money. And that's a short answer to an excellent question.
Thank you, Samantha.
Thank you.
And last but definitely not least
No.
is Margie Doyle to speak to us about I-594 and its aftermath. I want to just let you know that at the very latest, we have to be broken up at 5 minutes of 2 because we have to put this room back together. So with that knowledge, Margie.
Thanks very much, and I'm here to talk, give an update about gun safety legislation. I particularly want to thank Sarah Crosby and Marge Stanley. Sarah for her encouragement in developing this topic, and Marge for her daily Facebook posts that are always so to the point and pithy and funny and just really make you think and without feeling like you're in a study hall. So after Sandy Hook, it seemed like we as a nation, we were galvanized to protect our children, at least from gun violence. But on a federal level, it fell short, and we underestimated the organization, financial clout, and the appeals to fear and disempowerment by the National Rifle Association and other gun acquisition advocates. It inspired me that it was the parents of the children who were killed and who were subjected to that trauma, though, who said, this is just the beginning. We're not giving up the fight here. The League of Women Voters is positioned as to a growing movement for gun safety. While it is the constitutional right to bear arms, it's also our constitutional duty to defend life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Just recap, in Washington State, when I-594 was passed last November, Washington is a state where citizens can propose initiative measures to be approved or rejected by the voters. We closed the background check loophole for gun sales and gun sale shows and for internet gun sales. The League of Women Voters came out strongly in favor of this legislation. Locally, we gathered over 20 pages of signatures in support of the initiative. Statewide, the League early endorsed the initiative, which allowed us to mobilize our membership. We educated voters about the ballot measures in forums, in the gun safety toolkit, and in ballot measure summaries. Other members gathered signatures, did phone banks, donated to the campaign, and participated in fundraisers for League members. So in the end, the vote was 59% approval, even in the face of a countermeasure initiative. Today, I want to talk about my research into this area, namely touching on 5 points. One is the ongoing efforts to implement gun safety laws in the Washington State Legislature and other local entities. 2, the partner organizations in this effort. 3, I want to focus on background check laws effectiveness through 2 studies. One talking about the improvement with the implementation of these laws, and one talking about the decline with the repeal of gun background check laws. I used the League's gun safety toolkit to a great extent, and I want to touch also on the connection between mental health and gun safety. In the back of the room is a list of the links that I referred to where you can get more information about these efforts. And I just want to say it's really inspiring to see people just plugging away and making small steps towards a huge goal. Those who oppose legislation for gun safety will continue to lobby, to march, to file lawsuits and initiatives. Last December, about 1,000 gun protesters gathered at Olympia in an I Will Not Comply with I-594 rally. And they attempted an arrest sit-in where they were hoping to challenge I-594 by handing their guns off to each other without exchanging licenses or registering. That rally made front page news. There were no arrests. However, following the vote, it's been documented that at gun shows, both gun dealers and participants are cooperating with the law and are advising gun buyers how to comply with the law. Unfortunately, that doesn't make the news. So in the ongoing efforts to implement gun safety laws, Washington State Attorney General Bob Ferguson last week filed a motion to dismiss a challenge to I-594 from the Northwest School of Safety. So Ferguson said in filing this motion, no one has yet been prosecuted for violating I-594, and none of the plaintiffs have been threatened with prosecution. Simply put, the plaintiffs have not shown that I-594 actually harmed them, so they lack standing to bring this case. There's a couple of measures in front of the Washington State Legislature that we can all call our representatives and promote the passage of these measures. The first is Senate Bill 5789. It creates the crime of child endangerment due to unsafe storage of a firearm by requiring a firearms dealer to offer to sell or give the purchaser of a firearm a locked box, a lock, or a device that prevents the firearm from discharging. A few years ago, I became acquainted with a young teenager, a beautiful boy, who at his grandfather's house was playing with his gun and shot and killed himself. This is a tragedy that illustrates that if we have a culture of gun safety, if we really had a culture of gun safety, this might not have happened. The second measure is Senate Bill 5727, and in the digest of the bill, it establishes extreme risk protection orders that will temporarily prevent an individual from possessing, accessing, or purchasing firearms and dangerous weapons while that individual poses a significant danger of harm. Family members could be warned before police return guns to a person who had them seized by law enforcement. This bill was approved unanimously last Friday by the Senate. It's known as the Sheena Henderson Act for a woman who was fatally shot by her husband at Deaconess Hospital in Spokane. He recovered his guns that had previously been seized by the police. Mike Padden, who is a Republican from Spokane Valley, he's a senator, said, "This is a notification bill. It is not what anybody could call a gun control bill." And I draw your attention to his distinction between notification and control, because the League agrees with a number of other organizations about the importance of how we phrase our arguments in promoting gun safety and ending gun violence. Some of the organizations that are identified through the League of Women Voters Gun Safety Toolkit, I'm just going to mention here, along with my comment that I've lived on the islands for 14 years and I sense a real kind of territoriality about everything. And I find it inspiring that the League of Women Voters is so willing to partner with these other organizations to get the job done, not to get the credit. So first that I'll mention is Everytown for Gun Safety, which was founded by Mayor Michael Bloomberg of New York, originally Mayors Against Illegal Guns. That was one of the main contributors to the Washington State initiative, I-594. Second is the Washington Alliance for Gun Responsibility, which is a coalition of concerned citizens and organizations working together to forge common sense solutions to reduce gun violence. And the League of Women Voters of Washington is a member of this organization. During the first week of March, they recognized the League of Women Voters, saying They have been working on gun responsibility issues for a long time, and they continue to advocate for smarter policies like the extreme risk protection orders and child access prevention laws that Washington State needs. Thank you to the League for all the incredible work they continue to do. Then Washington Ceasefire is a statewide organization dedicated to reducing gun violence. The Americans for Responsible Solutions was founded by Gabby Giffords and her husband Mark Kelly on a national level, and then it has state branches. And then a group called momsdemandaction.org is informed by many relatives of victims of domestic violence. So while school shootings really grab our attention and seem particularly horrific, it's actually about 10% of the gun fatalities in the U.S., and 90% are through domestic violence, suicide, and gang activity. So I'm going to go into background checks a little bit, reviewing their history. Since 1968, federal law has banned the possession of firearms by convicted felons, domestic abusers, and people who are dangerously mentally ill. The Brady Law, enacted in 1993, requires a criminal background check before any licensed dealer can sell any firearm. And, if we recall, Brady was, the presidential assassination where Brady was shot was in, 1981, 82? And so it was 11 years before that law was passed. So, under federal law, background checks are only required for gun sales with licensed dealers. An estimated 40% of gun transfers, though, take place between private parties, often at gun shows or through anonymous online sales, and are not subject to the federal background check. 16 states, before last November, now it's 17 with Washington State, and Washington, D.C., go beyond federal law by requiring the background check for private handgun sales also. Evidence from these states, except for Washington because the evidence was compiled last year, shows that requiring a background check for private gun sales reduces crime and saves lives. In the time since background check legislation was instated in these states, the Bloomberg Group, the Mayors Against Illegal Guns, did a study with the Department of Firearms, Tobacco, and Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. And this study showed that in these states, women murdered by their intimate partners were 38% fewer in the states that had required the background check for private handgun sales. In states that require a background check for private handgun sales, there's 49% fewer firearm suicides, while the rates of suicide by other methods are just about the same, but there's almost a 50% decrease in firearm suicides. In states that require background checks for all handgun sales, there's 17% fewer firearm aggravated assaults, and police deaths are 39% fewer in the states where the background checks for private handgun sales is law. And these are officers who are killed by handguns. So on the other extreme is the state of Missouri, which for years required people to pass a background check and obtain a purchase permit before buying a handgun. In 2007, Missouri changed that law and dismantled its permit system and eliminated the background check requirement for private handgun sales. The gun murder rate in Missouri has risen by nearly 25% since the repeal of the state's purchase permit requirement. And the share of crime guns recovered in Missouri that were originally purchased in the state has grown by 23%. It's ironic that in 1999, the National Rifle Association endorsed background checks for all firearm sales at all gun shows. It had previously endorsed background checks for all firearm sales 3 times. But today they oppose it, and we just wonder what has changed in those 16 years. Funny you should say that, because I would like to bring up money. Mike, although it's interesting research, Mike Weiser is an English college professor who is the author of 3 volumes of books collectively called Gun Violence in America. The titles are Guns for Good Guys, Guns for Bad Guys, Hunters in the Wilderness, Opening and Closing the Frontier, and then this third, which I just emphasizes his title, Because They're Assholes, Violence and Gun Violence. He wrote in the Huffington Post, if gun safety advocates use the experience in Washington state as a template and begin moving ballot initiatives for background checks into other states, they will first negate the lobbying power of the NRA at the legislative level. And we will second use the financial resources of their chief supporters to equalize or overcome the monies that the NRA doles out for political campaigns. So in the I-594 contest, the supporters of that initiative spent nearly $8 million, while he says the opponents spent $500,000. And vote-wise, only garnered 41% of the vote. Of the money, $8 million spent for that initiative, Bloomberg and the Mayors Against Illegal Guns contributed $2.3 million. Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer contributed another $1.6 million, and Paul Allen donated $500,000. So that's the argument for the effect of money on campaigns. I also heard a statistic that the NRA gets half its revenue from gun manufacturers. However, the president of Washington Ceasefire, Ralph Fascitelli, wrote in crosscut.com a somewhat conflicting argument. He said universal background checks for gun purchases are supported on a state and national level by approximately 9 out of 10 voters. The public acceptance of the idea makes sense. The explanation for the failure is not the clout of the NRA or the gun manufacturers. The number one reason why gun control legislation fails to pass is that, with the sporadic exceptions of a tragedy like Virginia Tech or Sandy Hook, nobody speaks for the victim. Mothers Against Drunk Driving, MAD, was able to reduce drunk driving deaths in half over a 20-year span. Outraged parents made it their life mission to ensure changed culture and to produce legislation on the matter of drunk driving. And they succeeded despite opposition even more powerful and deep-pocketed than the NRA. So somewhere in the middle, the Washington Association for Gun Responsibility has a Hold Them Accountable fund that you can access on their website. They say, if you conspire with the gun lobby to kill common sense, bipartisan gun safety proposals, you have to face the consequences. The Hold Them Accountable fund today does exactly that. Holds accountable the politicians that are failing us by choosing the gun lobby over policies that help keep our communities safe. So I do want to really encourage you, my time's running short, to look at the Toolkit for Gun Safety on the League of Women Voters site. In particular, it leads you to great conversational cues to use in talking about gun safety, to persuade rather than to confront or enrage your opponents in the discussion. So just briefly, they say, don't say gun control, say preventing gun violence. Don't say stricter gun laws, but instead say stronger gun laws. And rather than saying you oppose the Second Amendment, say you support for the Second Amendment goes hand in hand with keeping guns out of the hands of dangerous people. Time and again, when we call for gun safety measures, the gun lobby will say it's not about guns, it's about mental health. Washington state law says that no person may own, possess, or have in his control any firearm if that person has been involuntarily committed for mental health treatment and their right to own a firearm has not been restored. Well, to my mind, that's a pretty minimal threshold. Just last month, the Sandy Hook Advisory Committee report came out with a 200-page document of its findings. A third of that was devoted to the connection between mental health issues and gun safety, along with school safety measures and law enforcement practices. So I myself have just glanced at that, but I encourage us all to look at that. The League of Women Voters policy statements from Impact on Issues says one of its policies is violence prevention and to support those programs in the communities. I wonder how many of us have contributed in those kinds of conversations on Orcas Island. We had a 4-time group response to Newtown that came up with a consensus statement. It was very difficult. We had a wide variety of opinions, and I say with all respect that we had some pretty mentally disturbed people in attendance too. And no, I say it with respect because that's, I mean, if we can't do it in our communities, we realize, you know, what we're up against. And the interim county manager, Bob Jean, held on each island 4 sessions about what we as a community want. And I understand, at least on Orcas, that mental health involvement was high on the priority list. The Peace Island Hospital, as part of their establishment here, had a task force about what the community needs are, and mental health was one of the top 3. I am compelled to bring up the impact of a woman who was confronted by a young man in a Georgia school. Her name is Antoinette Tuff, and she wrote a book called Prepared for a Purpose that was very profoundly moving when I read it last year. She says, everything I had done in my life up to this point prepared me for this moment. Being alone with a gunman, his 500 rounds of ammunition, and an angry promise to kill everyone, including himself, with his automatic weapon, an AK-47. She reacted with calm and with compassion. Antoinette Tuff is a Christian woman who, like Jewish and Islamic counterparts around the world, has a lifetime of studying and celebrating her religion. Her conclusions may be off-putting to those who pride themselves on rationality and impartiality, but I was humbled and convinced that her manner, bolstered by her faith, did more to bring a violent situation to a peaceful solution than squads of public safety officers have been able to do in similar situations. To calm down and with compassion address the argument, the League of Women Voters' commitment to civil discourse and impartiality places us with the reputation and the responsibility to break these tragic links in our culture between mental illness, violence, and gun use. It was just 2004 that Massachusetts was the first state to legalize same-sex marriage, and now the list is up to 32 states. Today, I hope we're galvanized to work through our organization to make those incremental moves towards establishing policy and laws that protect the health and safety of citizens through limiting the accessibility and regulating the ownership of handguns and semi-automatic weapons. The fast changes of internet technology have made us inclined to discount that often change happens very slowly. In just the last year, I have gone from pretty much ignoring Facebook to being a twice-a-day habitué of it. And it's because I often get encouragement from Facebook, such as this quote from Stephen Hawking. "Remember to look up at the stars and not down at your feet. Try to make sense of what you see and wonder about why the universe exists. Be curious, and however difficult life may seem, there is always something you can do and succeed at. It matters that you don't just give up." Thanks very much.
Officially conclude the program for today. However, if you have questions for Margie, maybe you would be at the back of the room for a few minutes.
Yeah.
We need to get people to go to the back of the room if you're going to stay around and talk, so that we may put the room back together. Thank you all for coming, and I want to just say that the League feels strongly that we need an informed and an active citizenry. And by your being here today and getting an update on these issues, you are considered a participant. And thank you very much for that.